as the 2023 year wraps up and we all collectively pretend that while this year sucked ass, next year will certainly be better, right? Right? Can someone please answer? Because if I'm not right, I'm going to... Well, regardless of how great 2024 will surely be, something that's been a stellar contribution to just how amazing this past year has been is the wonderful addition of the consistently vile and ever-present creeping of religious infighting into our cultural understanding of what it means to be a religious person in America. Now, I should clarify, I know that we're all used to the concept of Christianity's war on so many things. After all, in the good old days, we saw concerned Christian homeschool moms raging against Pokemon cards and Harry Potter books.
There are multiple scriptures in the Bible about sorcery and about witchcraft and how it is not of God. Well, you have this entire series of books and movies that it's about nothing else. The main thing that it's about is about sorcery and witchcraft. So for me, that's a black and white, that's a no.
And then as we grew up, we noticed how important abortion was to all of these sexually oppressive pastors.
Doctor specializing in women's health who also provided abortions and was also a devout Christian, serving as an usher at Sunday services when he was killed.
And then as we entered into the world of adulthood, we found that homosexuality and trans people, and really just the whole Democratic platform, were all major targets of the Christian culture.
You cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat in this nation. I don't care how mad that makes you.
But what's slowly happening now is that some of these Christians, you know, the type of people that make everything that they hate into their entire identity, like some kind of 14-year-old edgelords, they're all starting to realize that there isn't as solid a consensus among their peers in the church as they once thought that there was. This has caused a lot of sudden changes over the last couple of years. And we're seeing more and more palpable tension raise around all kinds of issues within the church that are culminating in more drastic changes at large, with everything from denominational structures or clergy disciplinary actions, and even some church-wide splits like we're currently seeing with the United Methodist Church. While it's easy to zoom out and see the church as a whole fighting with itself and kind of think, oh, well, obviously the church loves raging against things, it's only going to make sense that we would love raging at each other. But this type of infighting is likely a sign of much more systemic problems that will almost certainly change the face of the church forever. So let's talk about the realities of this current church fight. And more so, let's look at the coming implications of what a church-wide civil war, which will probably be super cool and super fun, will have as long as we allow these current trends to continue.
I'm the pastor of a Baptist church! And if you're not a Baptist, then get out!
For starters, I think it is time that I admit, obviously this isn't the first time churches in the US have disagreed on things, and the church has obviously split and changed and fought with its fellow Christians on everything from the type of music that was played in the service to infant baptism, for instance. But for some reason, this current tension seems more interesting to me, because it isn't an argument that's happening in just one denomination or one section of denominations, but rather it's more evenly distributed amongst all sects of Christianity, as well as being drawn along more cultural lines rather than theological ones. This only increases the problematic behavior, especially as we see younger generations now vying for power changes within their churches, as older generations are very purposefully and stubbornly standing in their way. So if this fight is somehow different from the fights that we've seen in the past, why is it happening? And why now versus any other time in history? And what's so special about these generations that they can't get along, and why is it that some of these issues are such a make or break for the church as a whole? Well, there's really only one major, most obvious issue that the church faces in its current postmodern age, and that is the fact that the church is currently hemorrhaging, dying, and gasping for breath. As a whole, it's losing people, and it's losing money, and it's losing political influence, and maybe most importantly, it's losing relevance, especially with younger generations.
Some of the things you found, 2/3 of young people stopped going to church between ages 18 to 22. Why?
This puts the church in an awkward position of having to undergo a public existential crisis of justifying its own existence within the culture of an also changing world. The church has for a long time been in the business of affirming social norms, especially of the median-aged members of society, and it kept a moral understanding of right and wrong within the culture, and while there have always been changing understandings of things like sexuality and marriage and raising children, the church has never really had to drastically change its own message, even if the methods and mechanisms of how it operated did change slowly over time. A great example of this is when it comes to music and worship in the church. It's obvious that churches, especially evangelical ones, have adapted to different musical styles of their worship services in order to keep interest. And while there have been many arguments among staff and church leadership about what constitutes good musical worship, there has never really been a church-wide questioning of whether or not music as a whole should be present. It simply always has been. Today's conflicts within the church are not around questions of style or aesthetics, but rather exist around the substance of what it means to be a church. And that is a storm that is not as easily weathered.
Honestly, it's only around 10% or so are actually no longer believing in God or the real fundamental beliefs of the church. It's things like the political views of the church, and when they feel like they're not being accepted, they're not being welcomed, if they have some different views, then they're going to be stepping away.
And this is where the generational pressure comes in. As the church began to realize that its existence was threatened and there was a need to try and change something, it was the older, wiser generations of leadership that recognized this first. After all, they've been through this before. And these older generations did what they always do. They sit down with experts and younger people and they got information. They looked at statistics. They said things like, we need a better youth pastor, or we need louder and better and younger sounding music, or we need a more online-focused ministry. And they sought to do the same types of changes that have helped us through the last 10 or so generational changes within the church. And us millennials saw this, and to the church's credit, it kind of worked. A little bit. And as millennials aged and began to have kids, they did eventually return slowly to some churches, though not nearly as much as previous generations. So when Gen Z began to go through these same churches' youth ministries and exit into the world only to essentially never return, the church was left stumped yet again. But they knew what to do, and the leadership tried all the same things they tried with millennials, and they came back with the same types of changes yet again. They changed the music, and they changed the online content, and they hired younger and tried being more accessible, and their minimal returns that they got with us millennials, while being better than nothing, with Gen Z, turned out to actually be nothing. These kids aren't coming back. And so the church has had to do a lot more reflection than it's used to. And it's been asking the younger leaders and experts to come up with other reasons why the church is simply not as interesting to younger members of the adult world. And the answer has been revealed. After years of studying and working and spending money, they've got all the statistics, they've got all the data, and the work has paid off. And the answer is, young people think the church that they grew up in is fucking stupid. It's filled with backwards-ass thinking morons. And the church as a whole has spent a lot of time investigating what Gen Z doesn't like about the church. And the answer is that they simply do not like the church itself and everything that it has stood for the last 20 fucking years. Now, I know what you old heads are thinking. My son or daughter still goes to church with their 2 kids every Sunday and they love it. Well, guess what? If your son or daughter has 2 kids, they probably aren't the generation that we're fucking talking about. But even if they are an exception, as the vast majority of this current youngest generation of adults in America are simply not interested in what the church they know has to offer. So this has caused a big problem. The church is now at odds with itself. It's realizing that the things that they currently stand for, the things that they think make them the church in the first place, are the very things that younger people hate about them. And if you really think about it, this kind of makes sense. The church for the last 40 years has been on tirade after tirade against multiple social issues that are now overwhelmingly supported by the vast majority of Americans. And even more so, these issues are universally agreed upon by the entirety of Gen Z. Homosexuality, abortion, political ties to the Republican Party in America are all on one side of the spectrum, while this generation finds itself vastly far away on the other side of that spectrum. And when you are so faced with the upcoming event that is your own destruction, and you see that the main reason for that is that your doctrines are the very thing that caused this kind of destruction, what is it that you have left to do? Slowly but surely, we've seen the mainline Protestant churches change their stances on some social issues. Ordination of women, capital punishment, civil rights, homosexuality, and abortion. All of these issues have enjoyed their own relevant doctrinal revisions in these denominations, like the Presbyterian churches, the Lutheran churches, the Methodist churches, and the Episcopalian churches. Though I do know that some of you are going to be saying something like, X denomination does not actually agree with blah, blah, blah. But shut the hell up for a second and just listen. These churches are understanding something simple that many of the rest of the church has not grasped yet. They get that the cultural understanding of America has shifted and is no longer on their side. and that as culture changes its understanding of social issues, it's normal and acceptable for the church to change along with it, as it has done for centuries. And that dichotomy is what essentially brings us up to speed with today. Because while some churches have made some changes to their doctrine on issues in order to come to terms with how separated they are from the current culture, other churches are kind of just refusing. And that's culminating in some big problems already. The Southern Baptist Convention voted to remove churches that ordained women clergy this year.
The vote to uphold the ban on churches with female pastors wasn't close.
And Saddleback Church is not in friendly cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention.
The United Methodist Church has currently shed thousands of congregations in 2023 that think the denomination is about to condone gay clergy as well as homosexual marriages. The Church of the Nazarene was just weeks ago publicly defrocking and kicking out a lead pastor of a large church in California because he was quote-unquote too open, whatever the fuck that means, to the LGBTQ discussion. By the way, not accepting of the people, just entertaining talking about being accepting.
Pope Francis has approved a landmark ruling that will allow Catholic priests to administer blessings to same-sex couples as long as they are not part of regular church rituals or liturgies.
Even the big bad bitch in a hat himself, Pope Francis, days ago decreed that priests in the Catholic Church may now bless those who are in committed homosexual relationships, much to the disdain of conservative bishops and priests around the world. And in all these denominations, there has been and will continue to be opposition. Conservative leadership in these denominations that label themselves as traditionalists or fundamentalists are coming out in force to push back against change in order to fight against the quote-unquote progressive agenda that in their minds are watering down the theology of the church.
When he responded to a letter written to him by 5 conservative cardinals who challenged him to be open to describe what the actual Catholic Church teaching on homosexuality is right now, I
think this is going to end up more significant than the church disagreements of the past. Sure, it might not end up as a great schism moment or anything, but it will certainly be one of the biggest shifts in the church since the Civil War era denominational splits over slavery. Younger people are speaking out in their churches, and the message is clear: learn to be flexible to other points of view or die. And the sad reality is that many among the oldies in leadership are aptly checking the box under the option, die, please.
I don't have any advice for homosexuals except to put a bullet in your own head so that you don't molest my kids or anyone else's kids.
So the stages are set for a great 2024. We have drawn lines in the sand. We have weaponry good to go. Fundraising will get harder for these churches that refuse to change. And the leadership of those churches that step out of line with their doctrine will be destroyed. So who will win? Well, the young people will, obviously, because the older people will just die, right? The next 20 years they're just all gonna die. Does that math add up? So I guess that solves that. But what denominations will survive in the meantime? That is a more interesting question. I think we'll start to see serious problems in some of the churches that have had once enjoyed great majorities. For instance, the Catholic Church. If the Pope can't operate fast enough, they will continue to bleed people below the age of 35 until they are essentially useless, though they do have money on their side, so we'll see how that goes. Evangelical churches, they will become more and more isolated. Surely they will become cult-like followings until they fade into irrelevance.
Your only chance to survive or evacuate is to leave with us.
And after all, if the Southern Baptist Church can't even let women speak in the same churches where their men are fucking diddling children, then what hope do they really have? Mainline churches, they will be the interesting ones to me. They will certainly suffer due to the bad rap given to all of Christianity by the evangelical church. Ultimately, if they can carve out a space for themselves to be seen as the voice of reason in a sea of batshit insane evangelical churches, maybe they can win back some of the younger people in their communities. But realistically, who knows? I'm just a dumbass pastor on the internet after all. So, I'll see you guys later. Sorry I've been gone so long. I actually do stay pretty busy this time of year, although that doesn't really excuse the last 6 months. So, yeah. Sorry. But subscribe for more, and I love you all.
I will never stop. I don't care what the cost is. I will never stop preaching the Bible.